An exciting story of redemption, love, passion, and new beginnings. She was sold like an object, but the man who bought her was hiding a devastating past. What was meant to be punishment transformed into desire, a secret and forbidden passion. Watch this story until the end. You'll be surprised by this story. If you like love stories, romance, subscribe to this channel, leave your comment. We post videos like this every day. Continuing. In the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, where the wind carries secrets among the vineyards and the morning mists hide truths that should never come to light, stands the Holy Sepulchre Winery, an ancestral property that hasn't known peace for decades, belonging to the most feared and respected man in Virginia, Edward Sullivan Montgomery. At 45, Edward carries on his shoulders the weight of an empire built on blood, tears, and decisions that few men would have the courage to make. His name is whispered with reverence in the salons of Richmond, but also with fear in the dark corners where business is conducted that will never see the light of day. Tall, with broad shoulders, and steel-colored eyes that seem to see through people's souls, Edward learned early that power isn't gained through kindness. He also learned that love is a weakness that the strong cannot afford. The Holy Sepulchre Winery isn't just a business. It's a monument to pain, a mausoleum of memories that Edward would prefer to forget. Built by his great-grandfather at the beginning of the last century, the property extends across acres of fertile land, but its true wealth lies in the secrets buried in its foundations. For 10 years, Edward has lived practically as a recluse in the main mansion, an imposing construction of stone and wood that dominates the landscape like a sleeping giant. Since the accident that destroyed his family, he doesn't receive visitors. He doesn't allow strangers to cross his gates. He doesn't trust anyone. Until today. The black car climbs the winding road leading to the property, raising a cloud of red dust that mixes with the moisture-laden air. In the back seat, Isabella Smith Matthews observes the landscape unfolding before her eyes like a slow-motion nightmare. At 20, she possesses a raw, natural beauty that draws attention even when she tries to hide. Wavy brown hair that captures the sunlight, dark green eyes that hold silent storms, and a body that still carries the grace of youth but already knows the weight of adult responsibilities. Her hands tremble slightly as she clutches the small, worn leather suitcase containing all that remains of her previous life. Inside are some simple clothes, a faded photo of her father, and a rosary that belonged to her grandmother. It's not much, but it's all she managed to save before her mother, Catherine Matthews, signed the document that sealed her fate. The Matthews family property, a small vineyard in the outskirts of Charlottesville, had been bankrupt for months. Debts accumulated like storm clouds, and creditors no longer accepted promises as payment. That's when Edward Montgomery appeared with an offer Catherine couldn't refuse. He would pay off all the debts, allow her to keep the house where she lived, and even pay a generous sum. In exchange, he wanted only one thing: Isabella. It wasn't a marriage he proposed. It was something much darker and more disturbing, an agreement, a contract signed in silence where words like love or happiness were never mentioned. Isabella would be his completely, for as long as he determined. She would live on his property under his rules without questions or resistance. In exchange, her family would be safe and protected. Catherine tried to explain to her daughter that there was no other choice, that men like Edward Montgomery don't make offers twice, that the alternative would be the complete ruin of everyone she loved. But what Catherine didn't say, what she would never have the courage to confess, is that she knew Edward long before he became the powerful man he is today. 23 years ago, they had been lovers. He was young, impetuous, full of dreams that she helped shatter when she chose the security of an arranged marriage instead of the uncertainty of true love. Edward never forgave her for that, and now, 2 decades later, he wanted his revenge. The car stops in front of the wrought iron gates that protect the entrance to the property. 2 men in dark suits approach, check documents with the driver, and signal for them to proceed. Isabella feels her stomach turn when the gates close behind them with a definitive metallic sound. There's no turning back, no escape. From now on, she belongs to this place and the man who governs it. The mansion appears before them like an apparition from another century. 3 floors of grey stone, tall windows protected by ornate grilles, and a wide staircase leading to the main entrance. Pointed towers rise at each corner, giving the whole structure a medieval air that contrasts with the modernity of the surrounding vineyards. It's impressive and terrifying at the same time. The driver stops the car in front of the staircase and quickly gets out to open Isabella's door. She hesitates for a moment, her fingers tightening on the handle of her suitcase until her knuckles turn white. Part of her wants to scream for the man to come back, accelerate the car and flee this place. But she knows there's nowhere to run. Edward Montgomery has long arms and an even longer memory. If she tries to escape, it won't be just her who pays the price. Taking a deep breath, Isabella steps out of the car and raises her chin. If she's going to face her destiny, she'll do it with her head held high. Her steps echo on the stone staircase as she climbs toward the dark wooden double doors. Before she can knock, they open silently, revealing a tall man in an impeccable suit with a neutral expression. "Miss Matthews," he says, with an almost imperceptible bow. "My name is James. I am the house butler. Mr. Montgomery is waiting for you in the library." Isabella enters a marble hall that seems to extend infinitely. The ceiling is high, decorated with a crystal chandelier that casts prisms of colored light across the walls. Ancient paintings of severe men watch her passage with eyes that seem alive. Her heels resonate on the marble as she follows James through corridors that smell of waxed wood and guarded secrets. The library is an immense room, with shelves that go from floor to ceiling, filled with leather-bound books. A fireplace crackles softly on one of the walls, and dark red leather armchairs invite reading. But Isabella barely notices the decor. Her attention is entirely focused on the man who rises from behind a mahogany desk when she enters. Edward. Montgomery is even more imposing in person than she had imagined. Tall, probably over 6 feet, he has the erect posture of someone accustomed to command. Black hair with silver threads at the temples is combed back with military precision. His skin is slightly tanned, evidence of time spent outdoors supervising the vineyards. But it's his eyes that leave her breathless. Grey like steel, they examine her with an intensity that makes her feel completely naked even though she's dressed. He's wearing a dark suit, perfectly cut, which highlights the breadth of his shoulders and the narrowness of his waist. There's nothing casual about his appearance. Every detail has been carefully planned to project power and control. When he moves around the desk, Isabella notices that he moves like a predator, silent, graceful, lethal. "Isabella," he says, and his voice is exactly as she expected. Deep, controlled, with a soft Virginia accent that can't completely mask the danger he represents. He doesn't offer his hand, doesn't smile, simply studies her like a collector examining a new acquisition. "Mr. Montgomery," she responds, forcing her voice to sound firm. She won't show fear, not to him, not to anyone. His eyes narrow slightly, as if he were surprised by her composure. Most people who enter his presence show some sign of nervousness. She is nervous. He can see that in the tension of her shoulders, in the way her fingers tighten on the handle of her suitcase. But she's not trembling, she's not begging. She's facing him as an equal, and that awakens something in him that he would prefer to keep buried. "I hope the journey was comfortable," he says, moving to stand behind one of the armchairs, using it as a barrier between them. It's a calculated move. He wants to maintain physical distance until he fully understands what he's dealing with. "It was adequate," Isabella responds. She's not going to thank him for the comfort or pretend this is a normal situation. They both know exactly why she's here. Edward tilts his head slightly, a cold smile touching the corners of his mouth. "Direct, I like that." He moves again, this time approaching her. "Let me be equally direct. You're here because your family owes me something that goes far beyond money. Your mother knows this, even if she didn't have the courage to tell you the whole truth." Isabella's heart accelerates, but she doesn't step back when he stops just a yard away. "What truth?" "That 23 years ago, Catherine Matthews destroyed my life when she abandoned me for a man with more money and less ambition." His voice is controlled, but Isabella can feel the anger that boils just below the surface. She promised me eternal love and delivered betrayal. Now it's time for her to pay for that. Isabella feels as if she's been punched in the stomach. Her mother had never mentioned a previous relationship with Edward Montgomery, had never talked about the past, except to say that she had met Isabella's father when she was young and that it had been a happy marriage until his premature death. "You're lying," she whispers. But even as she says the words, part of her recognizes the truth in his eyes. The pain he carries is too real, too deep to be feigned. "Am I?" he asks, taking another step closer. Now she can feel the heat of his body, the smell of his cologne mixed with something purely masculine that makes her pulse quicken in ways she doesn't want to analyze. "Ask her when you see her again, if you ever see her again." The implicit threat in his words makes Isabella finally take a step back. "What do you want from me?" Edward studies her face for a long moment, observing every micro-expression, cataloguing every reaction. She is stronger than he expected, more defiant. This should irritate him, but instead it awakens a hunger he hasn't felt in years. "I want you to pay for your mother's sins," he says finally. "I want you to understand what it means to be abandoned by someone you trust. I want you to feel a fraction of the pain she caused me." "And then?" Isabella asks, raising her chin defiantly. "After you get your pathetic revenge against a woman, through her innocent daughter, what happens?" Edward laughs, but it's a sound without humor. "Then maybe I'll let you go, or maybe not. That depends entirely on how well you adapt to your new life here." "New life," she repeats, savoring the words as if they were bitter in her mouth. "You mean my prison?" "I prefer to think of it as your education," Edward responds, moving away from her to return to the safety behind his desk. "You're going to learn about the real world, about how choices have consequences, about how debts are always collected even if it takes decades." Isabella looks around the library, observing the shelves filled with books, the crackling fireplace, the comfortable armchairs. "It's a golden prison, but still a prison. And if I refuse to participate in this farce, then your mother will lose everything," Edward responds simply. "The house, the land, the security. She'll be on the street, without money, without resources, without friends. Because you see, all of the Matthews family creditors now answer to me. I bought every debt, every promissory note, every contract. Catherine belongs to me as much as you do." The casual cruelty with which he makes the threat leaves Isabella momentarily speechless. This man isn't just powerful, he's ruthless. And she's completely at his mercy. "James will show you to your quarters," Edward continues, turning his attention to some papers on the desk, as if the conversation had ended. "Dinner is served at 8. Don't be late." Isabella remains motionless, for a moment, studying his profile as he pretends to read. There's something in the tense line of his jaw, in the way his fingers grip the pen, that suggests this conversation has affected him more than he wants to admit. Good. If he thinks she's going to passively accept the role of victim in his little revenge drama, he's very mistaken. "Mr. Montgomery," she says, waiting until he raises his eyes to her. When he does, she smiles. It's not a sweet or submissive smile. It's the smile of a woman who accepts a challenge. "I hope you're prepared to discover that we don't always get what we want. Sometimes, especially when it comes to people, things don't turn out exactly as we plan." Edward watches her as she turns and walks toward the door, her posture erect and proud. When she leaves, followed by James, he remains seated for a long time, staring fixedly at the closed door. 23. Years he had waited for this moment. 23 years planning his revenge, building his power, preparing for the day when he could make Catherine Matthews pay for abandoning him. But now that he has her daughter under his roof, something isn't going as expected. Isabella isn't the fragile and impressionable girl he had imagined. She's not a young version of her mother, moldable and easily manipulated. There's a strength in her, a determination that shines in her green eyes like fire. And when she smiled at him at the end of their conversation, Edward felt something he hadn't experienced in years: anticipation. This is going to be much more interesting than he had planned. Isabella's quarters are on the second floor of the mansion, in a wing that seems to have been specially prepared for her arrival. The suite is luxurious, with a king-size bed covered by cream silk sheets, antique furniture of noble wood, and tall windows that offer a panoramic view of the vineyards. There's even a small sitting area with a reading chair and a bookshelf filled with books. It's beautiful, it's comfortable, and it's clearly locked from the outside. Isabella discovers this when she tries to open the door an hour after James left her alone. The knob turns, but the door doesn't move. She's trapped here until Edward decides to free her. Sighing, she walks to the window and observes the movement in the vineyards below. Workers move between the rows of vines, their hats protecting them from the strong afternoon sun. They seem small from a distance, like pieces on a game board. Is this how Edward sees her, as a piece in his revenge game? A soft knock on the door interrupts her thoughts. "Miss," comes a woman's voice, "I've brought some things for you." Door opens and a middle-aged woman enters, carrying a tray with food and tea. She is short and robust, with grey hair tied in a bun and a gentle smile that seems genuine. "I'm Mrs. Martin," she says, placing the tray on a small table. "I'm the housekeeper. I thought you might be hungry after your journey." "Thank you," Isabella responds, genuinely grateful for the kindness. "That's very kind of you." Mrs. Martin studies her with eyes that have seen much over the years. "You seem like a good girl," she says finally. "I hope you find some peace here." "I don't think peace is what Mr. Montgomery has in mind for me," Isabella responds with an ironic smile. Mrs. Martin's expression becomes cautious. "The master is a complicated man. He carries much pain, but he's not a bad man." "No?" Isabella asks. "Then why do I feel like I've been sold to the devil?" Mrs. Martin hesitates, as if carefully weighing her words. "Sometimes, when a person suffers a lot, they forget how to be anything other than pain. But beneath the pain, there's still the man he was before." With that, she withdraws, leaving Isabella alone with her thoughts and the tempting aroma of food. As she eats, she reflects on the housekeeper's words. Edward Montgomery may carry pain, but that doesn't justify what he's doing. Using an innocent person to take revenge on another is cowardly and cruel. But as she watches the sun set over the vineyards, painting the sky in golden and pink hues, Isabella makes a decision. She won't be a passive victim in this game. If Edward wants a war, she'll give him a war, and perhaps in the process, both will discover that the line between love and hate is much thinner than they imagined. Dinner at 8 promises to be interesting. At 8 o'clock sharp, James knocks on Isabella's door to escort her to the dining room. She has carefully chosen her dress for the occasion, a simple wine-colored model she brought from home, which enhances her fair skin and the golden tone of her hair. It's not an expensive or elegant outfit like those that surely adorn the closets of the women Edward usually frequents, but it's dignified, and dignity is all she has at this moment. The dining room is as imposing as the rest of the house. A long table of solid mahogany dominates the center of the room, illuminated by a crystal chandelier that reflects the light of dozens of candles. Ancient tapestries adorn the walls, depicting scenes of hunting and medieval battles. It's an environment created to intimidate, to remind any visitor of the power and wealth of its owner. Edward is already seated at the head of the table, wearing a dark suit without a tie, the first button of his shirt open, revealing a small portion of his chest. He stands when she enters, a gesture of courtesy that strangely contrasts with the circumstances of her presence there. "Punctual," he observes, pulling out a chair for her. "I admire that quality." Isabella sits without thanking him, keeping her back straight and her hands crossed in her lap. "I didn't have much choice. The door to my room was locked." "Security measure," Edward responds casually, returning to his place. "This property is extensive and can be dangerous for those who don't know its paths. Or maybe you simply don't trust me not to try to escape." Edward pours wine into 2 crystal glasses, his movements precise and controlled. "Should I trust you?" "Probably not," Isabella admits with an honesty that surprises him. "If I were certain I could get out of here alive, I would have already tried." He pauses in the act of handing the glass to her. his grey eyes studying her face. Alive? Do you really believe I would physically harm you? I don't know what you're capable of, she responds, accepting the wine but not drinking. You kidnapped an innocent woman to take revenge on her mother. That's not exactly the behavior of someone stable. Edward laughs, a low sound that echoes through the hall. Kidnap? What a dramatic word. Your mother signed a contract voluntarily. Under coercion. Under economic necessity, he corrects. There's a difference. Only for those with a clear conscience. His smile gradually disappears, replaced by a darker expression. James enters, silently with the first course, a creamy soup that smells delicious, but the tension in the air is palpable. Tell me about your life before coming here, Edward says after they are alone again. What does a 20-year-old young woman do in a small town like Charlottesville? I worked at the family vineyard, Isabella responds, tasting the soup. It's delicious, but she can barely savor it due to the tension. I helped my mother with the administration, took care of the smaller vineyards, did the basic accounting. And boyfriends, suitors? The question seems casual, but there's something in the way he asks it that suggests genuine interest. Isabella studies him for a moment before responding. There was someone, she says finally, a boy from town. We had known each other since childhood. Edward takes a sip of wine, his fingers gripping the glass with more force than necessary. And where is this someone now? Far away, she responds, simply. When he found out I was coming here, he didn't want to fight for me. Then he wasn't a man worthy of your time. The statement is made with a conviction that surprises her. Isabella raises her eyes to find Edward observing her. Intensely, as if her answer were important in some way. And you? She asks, deciding to turn the game around. Surely a man in your position has a wife, a family. The change in Edward is immediate and dramatic. His shoulders stiffen, his jaw tightens, and for a moment, something dangerous flashes in his eye. As I don't have a family, he says, his voice icy. Not anymore. Not anymore. Isabella presses, feeling that she's touched on something important. What happened to them? Edward places the spoon on the table with a noise that echoes through the hall. That's none of your business. Perhaps not, she agrees. But if I'm going to live in this house, under your rules for an indeterminate time, I have the right to know what kind of man I'm dealing with. You're dealing with a man who learned that the people we love can destroy us more efficiently than any enemy, Edward responds, his voice loaded with a bitterness that hits her like a physical blow. You're dealing with someone who decided it's better not to love anyone than to run the risk of being betrayed again. Betrayed by whom? Isabella asks softly, feeling that they are reaching the core of everything. Edward rises abruptly from the table, walking to one of the tall windows that give a view of the gardens illuminated by the moon. He remains with his back to her, his hands clasped behind his body, his silhouette cut against the dark glass. My sister, he says finally, his voice so low that she needs to lean forward to hear him. Victoria. She was 5 years younger than me, the most important person in my life after our parents died. I would do anything for her. Isabella feels her heart tighten with the evident pain in his voice. What happened to her? She got involved. With a man, Edward continues, still with his back turned. Someone I didn't approve of, someone dangerous. When I tried to stop her from seeing him, she ran away from home. The following night, there was a fire at the hotel where she was hiding. She died along with 3 other people. The silence that follows is heavy and painful. Isabella can see the tension in Edward's shoulders, the way his hands close into fists. His pain is so intense that she can almost touch it. Edward, she begins, but he interrupts her. I don't want your pity, he says, turning to face her. His eyes are bright with an emotion she can't completely identify. I want you to understand why I don't trust easily, why I don't believe in promises of eternal love or unconditional loyalty. But that was your sister, Isabella says gently, not your mother. Why blame her for what Victoria did? Edward returns to the table, but doesn't sit. Instead, he leans on the edge, crossing his arms over his chest. Because Catherine taught me that women lie. that they promise one thing and do another, that when something better appears, they abandon everything without looking back. Not all women are the same, Isabella protests. You can't generalize an entire half of humanity based on the actions of two people. Can't I? Edward asks, his eyes fixed on her. Then prove me wrong. How? Stay, he says simply. Don't try to escape. Don't lie to me. Don't manipulate or use me. Be different from them. Isabella studies him for a long moment, processing what he's really asking. Beneath all the anger and thirst for revenge, she can see a deeply wounded man. A man who desperately wants to believe that not all people will betray him, but who doesn't know how to trust again. And if I do that, she asks, if I prove I'm different, what happens then? Edward doesn't respond immediately. Instead, he approaches her, stopping beside her chair. Isabella can feel the heat radiating from his body, can smell his cologne mixed with the subtle aroma of wine and something purely masculine. Then perhaps we can find a way to coexist that doesn't involve prisons or contracts, he says, his voice lower now, more intimate. Or, Isabella says, turning in the chair to face him, perhaps you'll discover that the person who most needs healing isn't me. For a moment, they remain like this, looking at each other, the air between them, charged with tension and unexplored possibilities. Edward extends his hand as if to touch her face, but stops at the last second, his fingers trembling in the air between them. You should be afraid of me, he whispers. I know, Isabella responds, without moving away. But for some reason, I'm not. The E. Confession seems to break something inside him. Edward recedes abruptly, passing a hand through his hair and destroying his perfect hairstyle. You should be, he says, his voice rough. You should be very afraid. James chooses this moment to return with the main course, breaking the moment of tension. Edward quickly composes himself, returning to his place at the table and once again assuming his mask of control. But Isabella saw the crack in his armor, saw the vulnerable man he so carefully hides. The rest of dinner passes in a tense silence, broken only by the sound of silverware against porcelain. Edward seems lost in thought, his gaze frequently drifting to her before quickly looking away. Isabella, for her part, finds herself studying every detail of his face, noticing the small lines around his eyes that speak of sleepless nights, the way he tightens his jaw when he's thinking, the unconscious elegance of his movements, even when he's disturbed. When they finish eating, Edward stands and walks to an elaborate bar in a corner of the hall. He serves 2 shots of an amber liquid in crystal glasses and returns, offering one to her. Bourbon, he explains. Made here on the property. A family recipe. Isabella accepts the glass, her fingers briefly brushing his. The touch is electric, sending a current of awareness through her entire body. By his eyes, she can see that he felt it too. What shall we toast to? She asks, raising the glass. Edward considers the question for a moment. To inconvenient truths, he says finally. To inconvenient truths, she echoes, touching her glass to his. The bourbon burns her throat, but it's a good burn, warming her from inside. Edward drinks his in one gulp, as if he needed the liquid. Courage. May I ask a question? Isabella says after a few moments of silence. You can try. Why me? Why not go directly after my mother if it's with her that you have an issue? Edward places his empty glass on the table and stares at her with an expression she can't decipher. Because hurting her directly would be too easy, too quick. I wanted her to feel what I felt, the loss, the hopelessness, the sensation that something precious was taken from her, and she can do nothing to recover it. And using her innocent daughter seemed the perfect way to do that. Yes, he admits without remorse, it seemed so. Seemed, Isabella repeats, catching the verb tense. And now? Edward stands again, but this time comes close to her. Very close. He leans down, resting his hands on the arms of her chair, trapping her between his arms. His face is inches from hers, and she can see the small golden flecks in his grey eyes, can feel his warm breath against her skin. Now, he says, his voice hoarse. I'm beginning to realize that perhaps I underestimated what I was dealing with. Isabella's heart is beating so hard that she's sure he can hear it. There's something in the way he's looking at her, an intensity that goes far beyond revenge or control. It's desire, raw and dangerous, and she can feel a corresponding response, awakening in her own body. "Edward," she whispers, not knowing if it's a request or a warning. He moves closer, his lips almost touching hers. For a moment, the world reduces to just the two of them, to the heat between their bodies, to the electric tension that seems to fill the air around them. Isabella closes her eyes, preparing for the kiss that seems inevitable. But he pulls away, at the last second, leaving her breathless and confused. "Good night, Isabella," he says, his voice controlled again, but she can see the effort it requires. "James will escort you back to your quarters." She remains seated for a moment, trying to process what just happened, the near intimacy of the moment, the way her body responded to his proximity, the manner in which he withdrew when he could have taken what he wanted. "Edward," she calls when he's almost at the door. He stops but doesn't turn. "You said you want me to prove I'm different from the other women who betrayed you," she says. "But what if the problem isn't with them? What if the problem is that you're so afraid of being hurt again that you sabotage any chance of real connection before it even begins?" This time he turns, and the pain in his eyes is so intense that she almost regrets having spoken. "Maybe you're right," he says softly, "but fear exists for a good reason. And while you're under my roof, living under my rules, it would be wise to remember that men haunted by ghosts are dangerous for those who try to get too close." With that, he leaves, leaving her alone in the dining room with the echo of his words and the taste of bourbon still burning in her throat. Back in her room, Isabella stays awake for hours, looking at the ceiling and reviewing every moment of the night. There's more to Edward Montgomery than the mask of control and power that he wears. There's pain, yes, but there's also kindness. There's fear, but there's also desire. And there's something else, something she barely dares to name. She's beginning to care for him, not just as an opponent in a power game, but as a man. A wounded man who has learned to build walls so high around his heart that he's forgotten how to tear them down. It's dangerous, this feeling that's growing inside her. Dangerous for both of them. Because if she's right about what she saw in his eyes tonight, Edward is beginning to care for her too. And a man like him, with so much power and so much pain, can be capable of anything when he feels threatened. But as she finally falls asleep in the early hours of the morning, Isabella makes a decision. She won't run away. She won't try to escape or manipulate him. She will stay and fight, not just for her freedom, but for something much more precious. She will fight for the soul of the man who brought her here for revenge, but who may discover that he found something much more valuable than he ever imagined. The next morning, Edward finds her in the gardens of the property, where she managed to convince Mrs. Martin to let her have breakfast outdoors. He's wearing more casual clothes today, dark jeans and a white shirt with rolled-up sleeves that reveals his tanned forearms. But even dressed casually, he still projects that aura of contained power. "Did you sleep well?" he asks, sitting in the chair opposite her at the small wrought-iron table. "Eventually," she responds, watching as he serves himself coffee from the thermos that Mrs. Martin brought. "And you?" "I rarely sleep well," he admits, and there's a casual vulnerability in the confession that surprises her. They drink coffee in silence for a few minutes, the morning sun filtering through the tree leaves and creating patterns of light and shadow on the table. It's almost normal, as if they were just two people sharing a meal, not captor and prisoner. "Would you like to see the property?" Edward asks suddenly. Isabella looks at him with surprise. "May I?" "As long as you promise not to try to escape." She considers the offer for a moment. "And if I promised, would you believe me?" "I don't know," he responds honestly, "but I'm willing to find out." It's a small act of faith, but significant coming from him. Isabella tilts her head in agreement. "I promise not to try to escape today." "Today," he repeats, a small smile, touching the corners of his mouth. A carefully limited promise. I'm a careful woman. I'm beginning to realize that. The tour of the property reveals the extent of Edward's empire. They walk through the vineyards, where he explains the cultivation process with a passion that illuminates his face in a way she had never seen before. They visit the cellars where the wines are aged, the cold and humid air carrying the sweet aroma of fermentation. He shows her the distillery where they produce the bourbon, the stables where they raise thoroughbred horses, the meticulously maintained gardens that surround the mansion. It's a complete world, self-sufficient and beautiful, but also isolated, lonely. "Do you live here alone?" Isabella asks as they stop to rest under the shade of a century-old tree. "For 10 years, Edward confirms, since Victoria died." "Doesn't it get lonely?" "I learned to prefer solitude to the company of the wrong people." "And me?" she asks bravely. "Am I wrong or right company?" Edward studies her for a long moment, his eyes passing over her face as if he were memorizing every detail. "I'm still deciding," he says finally. But there's something in the way he looks at her, a softness that wasn't there before, that suggests that maybe his decision has already been made. And maybe, just maybe, it's not the answer that either of them expected. The days that follow establish a strange and unexpectedly comfortable routine. Isabella wakes up early, has breakfast in the gardens when the weather allows, and then meets Edward somewhere on the property. Sometimes he's dealing with business, speaking on the phone in an authoritative tone with suppliers or buyers. Other times she finds him in the vineyards, supervising the work or simply walking between the rows of vines with a thoughtful expression. He doesn't explicitly invite her to accompany him, but he also doesn't send her away when she appears. It's as if both are testing the limits of this new dynamic between them, carefully exploring the unknown territory that is neither captor and prisoner nor host and guest, but something indefinable in between. On the third morning, Isabella finds him in the library, sitting behind the large mahogany desk with piles of documents spread before him. He's wearing reading glasses, something she had never seen before, and it gives him a more accessible, less intimidating air. "May I ask what you're working on?" she said, approaching the desk. Edward raises his eyes from the papers, removing his glasses and massaging the bridge of his nose. "Export contracts," he responds. "We're expanding to markets in Europe and North America." "It must be complicated," Isabella comments, noticing the tension in his shoulders. "Dealing with international commercial laws, different currencies, regulations." He studies her with renewed interest. "You understand business?" "A little," she admits, sitting in the chair in front of the desk. "I managed my family's small vineyard, remember? Obviously on a much smaller scale than this, but the basic principles are the same." Edward leans back in his chair, observing her with an expression she can't decipher. "Show me," he says, pushing some of the documents toward her. For a moment, Isabella hesitates. Accepting the invitation means entering his professional world, becoming part of his day-to-day in a way that goes beyond their current situation. But curiosity wins and she pulls the papers close. Over the next 40 minutes they work side by side, Edward explaining the details of the contracts while she asks intelligent questions and offers observations that surprise him with their insight. There's something deeply intimate in this collaboration, in the way their heads lean together over the documents, how his fingers brush hers when they point to specific numbers. "You might consider including a more comprehensive force majeure clause here," Isabella suggests, pointing to a section of the contract. "With climate change affecting world agriculture, extreme weather events are becoming more common." Edward stops writing and looks at her with genuine admiration. "That's very smart," he says. "I hadn't thought of that. My family lost an entire harvest 3 years ago due to an unseasonable frost," she explains. "We learned the hard way that it's better to be prepared for the impossible." "Your family," Edward repeats, and something in the way he says words makes Isabella tense. "Tell me more about your mother." The change of subject is abrupt, but Isabella realizes it's not random. They were getting too close, sharing too much, and Edward needs to remind himself why she's here. "What do you want to know?" she asks carefully. "What was it like growing up with her? What kind of mother was she?" Isabella considers the question, looking for signs of traps. "She was overprotective sometimes, especially after my father died. She seemed afraid that something terrible would happen if she didn't control every aspect of my life. Controlling, Edward murmurs, as if this confirmed something he already suspected. Not in the way you're thinking, Isabella protests. She carried a lot of weight on her shoulders, the responsibility of keeping the property running, of raising me alone, of preserving the family legacy. Sometimes I think she forgot how to be happy. And what about your father? What did she tell you about him? That he was a good man, kind, hard-working, that he loved her very much. Isabella pauses, studying Edward's expression. But sometimes I noticed there were gaps in her stories, periods of her life before marriage that she never mentioned. Like what periods? Her youth, the years before she got married. When I asked about previous boyfriends or about what her life was like when she was young, she would change the subject or say there was nothing interesting to tell. Edward rises abruptly from his chair and walks to the window, standing with his back to her. Isabella can see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands close into fists at his sides. "Edward," she calls softly, "what happened between you two?" For a long moment he doesn't respond. When he finally speaks, his voice is loaded with a pain that hits her like a physical blow. "I loved her," he says simply. Completely, desperately, in a way that a 22-year-old man shouldn't be able to love. She was everything to me. Isabella feels her heart tighten. "And her? Did she love you too?" "I believe she did," Edward responds, still with his back turned. "She told me she did. We made plans together. We talked about marriage, about having children, about building something lasting. I was ready to give her everything I had. But I was young and idealistic. Rich in land and possibilities, but poor in liquid assets. I needed time to transform potential into reality." He turns to face her, and the bitterness in his eyes is almost unbearable. Catherine wasn't willing to wait. "What did she do?" "She met your father at a party in Richmond. He had money, immediate stability, an established social position, everything I was still building." Edward returns to the desk, but doesn't sit. Instead, he rests his hands on the surface and leans toward her. "1 week after telling me she loved me, she was engaged to another man." The pain in his voice is so intense that Isabella instinctively extends her hand, covering one of his with hers. He looks at their intertwined hands for a moment before pulling away. "She didn't even have the courtesy to tell me personally," he continues. "I found out through third parties, and when I went to confront her, she told me it had just been a summer fling, that it had never been serious." "Edward, I'm so sorry." "I don't want your pity," he says brusquely. "I want you to understand why you're here, why your mother will pay for what she did." "But I'm not my mother," Isabella protests, standing up too. "And what she did more than 20 years ago doesn't justify what you're doing now." "Doesn't it?" Edward asks, circling the desk to stand before her. "She destroyed me. She taught me that love is a lie, that women's promises are worth nothing. Because of her, I could never trust anyone again. And because of your inability to get over a youthful betrayal, you've become exactly the kind of man she was right to avoid," Isabella retorts, her own anger finally emerging. "Controlling, manipulative, unable to see people as individuals, instead of extensions of your own wounds." Edward's face darkens dangerously. "Be careful what you say." "Or what?" she challenges, taking a step toward him instead of backing away. "You'll hurt me, lock me in a basement, sell me to another man like you did with my mother?" "I never sold your mother to anyone." "No? Then what do you call a contract that exchanges her daughter for money and property?" "I call it justice." "I call it cowardice." The word hangs in the air between them like a bomb about to explode. Edward remains motionless for a moment, his eyes fixed on hers, and Isabella can see the war happening inside him. Anger, pain, surprise, and something else that she can't identify. Then, without warning, he moves. His hands capture her face, his fingers tangling in her hair, and his mouth finds hers in a kiss that is more battle than affection. It's desperate, angry, full of years of repressed pain and denied desire. For a moment, Isabella is paralyzed by the intensity. But then, Something inside her responds, matching his passion with her own. She grabs the front of his shirt, pulling him closer, their mouths moving together with an urgency that borders on violence. It's Edward who breaks the kiss, pulling away abruptly and running a hand through his disheveled hair. His breathing is heavy, his eyes dark with desire and confusion. "This shouldn't have happened," he says, his voice hoarse. "But it did," Isabella responds, touching her swollen lips. "And it happened because no matter what you say about revenge and justice, there's something real happening between us." "There's nothing happening between us," Edward denies, but the words sound empty even to him. "Isn't there?" Isabella asks, approaching him again. "Then why did your hands tremble when you touched me? Why do you back away every time we get too close? Why do you spend hours watching me when you think I'm not paying attention?" Edward looks at her as if she were a puzzle he can't solve. "You're the daughter of the woman who betrayed me. You should mean nothing to me." "But I do," Isabella says softly, "and that terrifies you." Before he can respond, the library door opens and James enters, carrying a tray with afternoon tea. He stops when he sees the two standing so close to each other, the electric tension still palpable in the air. "I'm sorry, sir," he says diplomatically. "Should I come back later?" "No," Edward responds quickly, moving away from Isabella and smoothing his shirt. "Miss Matthews was just helping me with some contracts. We're finished." James places the tray on a side table and withdraws, but not before casting a speculative look between the two. When they are alone again, the moment of intimacy is gone, replaced by a tense embarrassment. "I'll let you get back to work," Isabella says, heading for the door. "Isabella!" Edward calls when she's almost leaving. She stops but doesn't turn. "What happened here? Can't be repeated." "All right," she says, finally looking over her shoulder at him. "But know that when you're ready to stop lying to yourself about what you really want, I'll be here." With that, she leaves, leaving Edward alone with his turbulent thoughts and the taste of her still on his lips. That night, neither Edward nor Isabella appear for dinner. Mrs. Martin takes a tray to Isabella's room, finding her on the balcony, looking at the stars with a thoughtful expression. "Are you all right, dear?" the housekeeper asks gently. "I'm fine," Isabella responds, but gratefully accepts the hot food. "Mrs. Martin, may I ask a question?" "Of course. How long have you—" "Worked for Mr. Montgomery." 15 years, Mrs. Martin responds, sitting in the other chair on the balcony. "Since before the accident with Miss Victoria." "What was he like before?" Mrs. Martin remains quiet for a moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. "Different," she says finally. "Younger, of course, but not just in age. There was a lightness in him that disappeared after he lost his sister. He laughed more, trusted more, believed that the world was fundamentally a good place." "And now?" "Now he lives as if he's waiting for the next betrayal, the next loss, as if protecting against it was more important than actually living." Isabella absorbs these words, seeing Edward in a new perspective. "Has he brought other women here?" "Not in the way you're thinking," Mrs. Martin responds carefully. "There have been occasional encounters over the years, but nothing serious. Nothing that lasted more than a few weeks, and never on the property. You're the first woman to stay here since Miss Victoria." "Why do you think he brought me then?" Mrs. Martin leans forward, studying Isabella's face in the starlight. "Initially revenge, as he said, but now I think maybe he's found something he wasn't looking for." "What do you mean?" "A chance to heal, a chance to leave the past in the past and build something new." Mrs. Martin stands, gathering the empty tray. "The question is whether he'll have the courage to accept that chance." After the housekeeper leaves, Isabella remains on the balcony for hours, processing everything that happened. The kiss still burns in her memory, not just the physical passion, but the vulnerability she saw in Edward's eyes. Beneath all the anger and thirst for revenge, there's a lonely man who desperately wants to connect with someone, but who has learned to equate intimacy with danger. It's an impossible situation. She is his prisoner, brought here against her will to satisfy his need for revenge. Any feelings she may be developing for him are complicated by these circumstances, and yet she can't deny there's something powerful growing between them, something that goes far beyond physical attraction. The next morning, Isabella wakes up determined to confront the situation head-on. She finds Edward in the stables, brushing a magnificent black horse with repetitive movements that suggest he's using the activity to calm his mind. "We need to talk," she says without preamble. Edward doesn't stop brushing the horse, but she can see the tension in his shoulders. About? About what happened yesterday. About what's happening between us. "Nothing is happening between us," he repeats, but with less conviction than before. "Edward, stop," Isabella says, approaching and placing her hand over his, forcing him to stop brushing. "Stop pretending you don't feel anything. Stop using your pain as an excuse not to live." He finally faces her, and she can see the war in his eyes. "You don't understand. I can't allow myself to feel this." "Why not?" "Because the last time I allowed myself to love someone, they left me. My mother died. Catherine abandoned me. Victoria killed herself, practically. All the women who ever meant something to me left me in one way or another. And then you decided it was better not to love anyone than to run the risk of being left again." "Exactly." Isabella moves closer to him, placing her hands on his chest, feeling the accelerated beats of his heart. "But living without love isn't really living. It's just existing. And you deserve more than that." "And you?" Edward asks, his hands covering hers. "You deserve more than being a prisoner of a man obsessed with the past?" "Maybe," she admits. "But maybe I also deserve the chance to help this man find his way back to the light." For a moment, they remain like this, looking at each other, the world reducing to just the two of them, and the soft sound of the horses breathing beside them. Edward raises a hand to touch her face, his fingers tracing the line of her cheek with a tenderness that drastically contrasts with the wild passion of the kiss the day before. "You're dangerous," he whispers. "Am I?" she asks, leaning into his touch. "You make me want things I swore I'd never want again." "Like what?" "Like waking up beside someone every morning, like sharing not just a bed, but a life, like believing that maybe, just maybe, I can trust someone again." Isabella's heart accelerates with the raw honesty in his words. "Edward." "But I can't," he says, pulling away from her abruptly. "I can't forget why you're here. I can't forget who your mother is, what she did to me." "Then let me go," Isabella says softly. "If you can't see me for who I am, if you can only see the daughter of the woman who hurt you, let me go and end this." Edward looks at her for a long moment, and she can see the battle happening inside him, revenge against desire, past against present, fear against hope. "I can't," he admits. "Finally, God forgive me, but I can't let you go." "Why not?" "Because you've become more important to me than my revenge, and that terrifies me more than anything I've ever felt." The confession hangs in the air between them, raw and vulnerable. Isabella feels tears, stinging her eyes, not from sadness, but from something that might be hope. "So what do we do now?" she asks. Edward doesn't respond immediately. Instead, he approaches her again, his hands framing her face with a gentleness that contradicts all his reputation as a ruthless man. "Now," he says, his voice hoarse with emotion, "we try to discover if it's possible to build something real upon the ruins of what was destroyed." And then he kisses her again, but this time it's different. There's no anger or desperation, just a deep tenderness and a silent promise that maybe, just maybe, both can find a way to heal the wounds of the past and build something new together. The days following the second kiss are like walking an emotional tightrope. Edward and Isabella move around each other with a new and intense awareness, each look loaded with meaning, each accidental touch sending waves of electricity through their bodies. There's a growing intimacy between them, but also an unresolved tension that hangs in the air like an approaching storm. Edward still hasn't said the words that would officially free Isabella from their agreement. She is still technically his prisoner. But the rules have fundamentally changed. Their meals have become long and deep conversations. Their walks around the property have transformed into stolen moments of near intimacy. At night, they separate, with growing reluctance, each going to their quarters but remaining awake for hours thinking of the other. It's on the 5th morning after the kiss that everything changes. Isabella is in the library, reading a book of poetry she found on the shelves when she hears the sound of a car arriving. She looks through the window and sees a black sedan stopping in front of the mansion, followed closely by another vehicle. Men in dark suits get out of the cars, and she immediately recognizes that they are not social visitors. Edward appears at the library door moments later, his face a mask of controlled tension. "I need you to go to your room and not come out, no matter what you hear," he says, his voice low but authoritative. "What's happening?" "Business," he responds curtly, but his eyes tell a different story. There's concern there, and something. That might be fear. "Please, Isabella, just do what I'm asking." She wants to protest, wants to demand an explanation, but something in the urgency of his voice makes her just nod. She kisses him quickly, an impulsive gesture that surprises them both, before heading for the staircase. From the 2nd floor corridor, she can hear voices in the entrance hall but can't distinguish the words. What she can distinguish is the tone, tense, confrontational, dangerous. Edward is speaking with someone, his voice controlled but with a sharp edge that she recognizes from their first encounters. Unable to resist curiosity, Isabella sneaks to a window that gives a view of the side entrance of the house. She can partially see the living room through the ground floor windows, where Edward is standing before 2 men. One of them is tall and thin, with grey hair and an expression that even at a distance seems cruel. The other is younger, robust, with the kind of posture that suggests violence as a profession. The conversation intensifies, gestures becoming more animated. The older man points his finger at Edward, clearly making some kind of demand. Edward shakes his head, his posture rigid and inflexible. Then, to Isabella's horror, the younger man draws a gun. Her heart stops for a moment before starting to beat violently. She wants to scream, wants to run downstairs, but forces herself to stay where she is. If she appears now, she may worsen the situation for Edward. The gun isn't pointed directly at Edward, but its presence changes the entire dynamic of the conversation. Now, it's clearly a threat, not a negotiation. Edward remains motionless, but Isabella can see the tension in every line of his body. The conversation continues for a few more minutes before the visitors finally leave. Isabella watches them get into the cars and depart, their tires raising, gravel in the circular driveway. Only then does she allow herself to breathe again. She runs downstairs and finds Edward still in the living room, standing before the window with his hands in his pockets, watching the cars disappear in the distance. "Edward," she calls, and he turns, his face still tense. "I told you to stay in your room." "There was a gun," she says, ignoring his reprimand. "I saw through the window. Who were those men?" Edward closes his eyes for a moment, passing a hand over his face. When he opens them again, she can see exhaustion and something that seems like defeat. "Part of my past," he says finally. "A part I hoped I'd never have to face again." "What part?" Edward moves to the bar and serves a generous shot of whiskey, drinking half in one gulp. "Do you remember me mentioning that my sister's death wasn't accidental?" Isabella nods, a feeling of apprehension growing in her stomach. The man Victoria was involved with, he wasn't just dangerous because of drugs or common crime. He was part of a larger organization. When she died in that fire, I didn't simply accept that it was an accident. I investigated. I discovered that the fire was intentional. "My God," Isabella whispers. "I used all my influence, all my money, all the contacts I had to destroy the men responsible for my sister's death. I managed to get most of them imprisoned or killed, but some escaped, hid. The man who was here today, Richard Sanders, was the leader of the group." The name hits Isabella like a physical blow. "Sanders? He's my uncle," Edward completes, "my father's brother. The family that should have protected me was who destroyed everything I loved." The complexity of the situation, the layers of betrayal and pain, leave Isabella momentarily speechless. What did he want? For me to stop pursuing him. To accept a peace agreement. To forget what happened to Victoria in exchange for him stopping threatening everything I've built. And you. I refused, of course. Edward finishes his whiskey and places the glass on the table with more force than necessary. Some things can't be forgiven or forgotten. But he had a gun. He was threatening you. He was testing my determination, seeing if I would yield under pressure. Edward approaches her, his hands capturing her face. Isabella, you need to understand, these men are dangerous. While you're here, you may be in danger. Then let me go, she says, but without real conviction. The idea of leaving Edward now when he might be in danger is unbearable. I can't, he admits. Not just because of our original agreement, but because if something happens to you because of me, I won't survive it. The raw confession of vulnerability hits her deeply. This powerful man, who built an empire and faced dangerous enemies, is admitting that she has become his weak point. So what do we do? I'll handle this, Edward says, his voice hardening. As I always have, as I always will. Alone? It's the only way I know. Isabella studies his face, seeing the iron determination that has taken him so far in life, but also the loneliness that keeps him isolated from the world. It doesn't have to be, not anymore. Isabella, no, she interrupts him. For weeks you've told me that I'm paying for my mother's sins, that I represent betrayal and abandonment. But now you have the chance to discover if you can trust someone, if you can let someone stand by your side when things get difficult. Edward looks at her for a long moment, war visible in his eyes. If I allow you to stay, if I stop pretending, this is just about revenge, there's no going back. You understand that? If you choose to stay with me, you'll be choosing a life that may be dangerous, complicated, full of enemies and ghosts from the past. And if I choose to leave, then I'll let you go, he says, and she can see that he's serious. I'll annul the contract with your mother, ensure that you two are safe and protected and never bother you again. It's the first time he's genuinely offered her freedom without conditions or manipulations. And ironically, it's the first time she's not sure she wants it. I need time to think, she says finally. How much time? A day. Until tomorrow morning. Edward agrees with a nod, but she can see the fear in his eyes. Fear that she'll choose to leave. Fear of being alone again with his demons. That night, Isabella can't sleep. She spends hours on the balcony of her room, looking at the stars and weighing her options. She can return home to her simple but safe life in Charlottesville. She can try to start over, find a gentle man without complications, have a normal life. Or she can stay with Edward, a man tormented by tragedies and pursued by enemies, but who makes her feel more alive than she's ever felt. At 2 a.m, she makes her decision, but before she can speak with Edward, she needs to do something first. The next morning, she finds Mrs. Martin in the kitchen preparing breakfast. I need to use the phone, Isabella says. I need to call my mother. Mrs. Martin studies her for a moment before nodding. Use the phone in the small office, you'll have privacy there. The conversation with Catherine is difficult and painful. Isabella tells her about her situation, about Edward, about the revelations of the last few days. And finally, she asks the question she needs to ask. Mom, she says, her voice firm despite the emotion, I need you to tell me the truth about Edward Montgomery. The whole truth. There's a long silence on the other end of the line before Catherine finally begins to speak, and what she reveals changes everything. 23 years ago, Catherine didn't just abandon Edward for another man. She discovered she was pregnant and fled without telling him, convinced that he wouldn't be a good father because of his youth and emotional instability at the time. The man she married, the father Isabella always knew, agreed to raise the child as his own daughter. You're saying, Isabella whispers, her world crumbling around her, that Edward Montgomery is my biological father. Yes, Catherine admits, her voice broken by tears. And he never knew. I never told him. Isabella hangs up the phone with trembling hands, feeling physically sick. Everything makes sense now. The way Edward looked at her when they met, as if he were seeing a ghost. The way he said she was more important than his revenge. The inexplicable connection she felt with him from the first moment. He brought his own daughter home as a prisoner, without knowing who she really was. She finds Edward in the library, sitting behind his desk, with papers spread before him, but clearly unable to concentrate. He raises his eyes when she enters, and she can see the tension and hope at war on his face. "Have you made your decision?" he asks. "Yes," Isabella responds, closing the door behind her. "But first there's something you need to know." She tells him about the call, about her mother's revelations, watching his expression change from confusion to shock to a pain so deep it cuts her heart. "No," he whispers, rising from the chair, so abruptly that it falls over. "No, this can't be true. Edward, you're my daughter?" His voice is hoarse, broken. "All this time, I thought, I brought my own daughter here as a prisoner. God, what have I done?" Isabella approaches him, seeing the powerful man disintegrate before her eyes. "You didn't know. It's not your fault." "Not my fault?" Edward laughs, but it's a sound without humor, full of self-hatred. "I kidnapped my own daughter. I kept you here against your will. Jesus, I kissed you. I desired you." "Edward, stop," Isabella says firmly, capturing his face between her hands and forcing him to look at her. "Look at me. Really look at me." Reluctantly, his eyes meet hers. "I grew up with a father," she says softly. "A good man who loved me and raised me as his own daughter. You may be my biological father, but you're not my father in the sense that matters. You're the man I fell in love with." "This is wrong," Edward protests, trying to pull away, but she doesn't let him. Why? Because of shared blood that neither of us knew existed. Because of an accident of genetics that doesn't define who we are or what we feel for each other. "Isabella, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," she interrupts him. "I understand that the man who raised me, who taught me to ride a bicycle and consoled me when I cried, was my true father. I understand that you are a stranger, who shared DNA with me, but who became something completely different. I understand that love has nothing to do with blood and everything to do with choice." Edward looks at her, as if she were a miracle and a curse at the same time. "You can't. Be serious." "I'm more serious than I've ever been about anything in my life," she responds. "The question is, can you separate the accident of our biological connection from the reality of who we really are to each other?" Edward struggles with himself. She can see the battle in his eyes. Finally, he speaks. "Even if I could, even if we could overcome this, there's still the problem of my enemies. Richard won't simply disappear. Then we deal with him together." "Together?" "You have money, power, influence. I have a clear mind, and I'm not carrying 20 years of anger and pain. Maybe together we can find a solution that you couldn't find alone." Edward studies her face for a long moment. "You would really stay? Knowing everything you know now, all the dangers, all the complications. Only if you stop seeing me as the daughter of the woman who betrayed you, or as the child you never knew you had, and start seeing me as I really am, a woman who loves you for the man you are, not for the past you carry." The word love hangs between them, raw and powerful. It's the first time either of them has used that word, and the impact is palpable. "You love me?" Edward asks, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Isabella responds without hesitation. "I love you. Not the monster you think you are. Not the ghost of the young man my mother knew, but the man standing before me now. The man who took care of me, even when he thought he hated me. The man who opened up to me, even when it terrified him. The man who is willing to let me go because he thinks it's best for me." Edward closes his eyes, a single tear escaping and sliding down his cheek. When he opens them again, there's something different in them, a piece she had never seen before. "I love you too," he says, his voice strong and clear. "God forgive me, but I love you more than I ever thought it was possible to love someone." And then he kisses her, and this time there's no doubt or hesitation. It's a kiss of commitment, of choice, of two adults consciously deciding to build something new upon the ruins of the past. When they separate, Edward rests his forehead on hers. And now? Now we deal with Richard and then begin our real life, together. You have a plan? Isabella smiles. Actually, I do, but you won't like it. She's right. Edward hates the plan, but after much debate and some modifications, he agrees that it might work. 3 days later, Richard Sanders returns to the property, this time alone, responding to an unexpected invitation from Edward for a final discussion. He enters the library, finding Edward sitting calmly behind his desk, a sealed envelope before him. "Changed your mind about our proposal?" Richard asks, settling into the chair opposite. "In a way," Edward responds, "I decided that some wars aren't worth fighting." Richard smiles, clearly satisfied. Wisely. "Victoria has been dead for a long time. It's time to let the dead rest." "I agree," Edward says, pushing the envelope across the desk. "This document formalizes our truce. I stop pursuing you. You stop threatening my business and the people I love." Richard takes the envelope but doesn't open it. "And in exchange..." "In exchange, you leave the United States and never come back. There's a check in the envelope that will give you the means to start a new life anywhere in the world." "Generous," Richard comments, finally opening the envelope. He quickly reads the document, his eyes widening when he sees the amount of the check. "Very generous." "I have my reasons." Richard puts the papers in the inside pocket of his jacket. "And the girl. I heard you're keeping the daughter of an old girlfriend here." "That's none of your business." "Just curiosity," Richard says, standing up. "I've always admired your dedication to memory. First Victoria, now this Isabella. You collect dead and lost women, nephew." Edward stiffens. "Watch what you say." "Or what?" Richard asks, his friendly mask slipping to reveal the cruelty beneath. "You've already signed our peace. Your hands are tied now." It's then that Isabella emerges from the shadows behind the bookshelves, a small recorder in her hands. "But mine aren't." Richard turns, confused. "Who are you?" "The dead and lost. Girl you just mentioned," Isabella responds calmly. "And you just confessed to the murder of Victoria Montgomery on a recorder." Richard's face transforms, the realization of what happened hitting him like a blow. This was a trap. "It was," Edward confirms, standing up, "and it worked perfectly." "You can't use that. It's inadmissible in court." "Maybe," Edward agrees, "but I have friends in the police, in the prosecutor's office, in the media. Even if it's not enough for a conviction, it will be enough to ruin any attempt of yours to live a normal life." Richard looks between the two, calculating his options. "You don't know who you're playing with." "We know exactly," Isabella says. "An old and frightened man who uses threats because he has no real power anymore." "You have a choice," Edward adds. "Accept the money, leave the country and never look back. Or stay and find out if I still have the necessary influence to destroy your life, as you destroyed mine." For a moment, Richard seems to consider fighting. But then, seeing the determination on both faces, he yields. "I hope you two are happy. Together," he says with venomous sarcasm, "until you destroy each other." After he leaves, Edward and Isabella are alone in the library, the weight of the last few days finally lifting from their shoulders. "Is it over?" Isabella asks. "It's over," Edward confirms, pulling her into his arms. "Richard will leave the country and never come back. He's too smart to risk everything for pride." "And us? Is it over for us too?" Edward smiles, the first genuinely happy expression she's seen on his face. "For us, it's just beginning." He kisses her again, but this time there's a different promise in the kiss. A promise of future, of possibilities, of love built on conscious choice instead of imposed circumstances. When they separate, Edward goes to the drawer of his desk and takes out a paper, the original contract that brought Isabella into his life. Without ceremony, he tears it in half. "Now you're truly free," he says, "free to choose whether you want to stay or go." "I've already made my choice," Isabella responds, taking the pieces of the contract and throwing them into the fireplace. "I choose to stay, I choose you, I choose us." Even knowing everything, the past, the dangers, the complications, especially knowing everything, she responds. Real love isn't love despite the imperfections. It's love because of the totality of the person, including their scars. Edward pulls her closer, burying his face in her hair. I love you, he whispers. And for the first time in 20 years, I'm not afraid to say that. I love you too, she responds, and I won't leave you, never. It's a promise they both intend to keep. 6 months later, the Holy Sepulchre winery holds its first party in a decade. The halls of the mansion are full of guests, music, and laughter. Edward, wearing an impeccable tuxedo, circulates among the guests with Isabella at his side, dressed in a dark blue silk dress that enhances her eyes. They officially announce their engagement that night, to Mrs. Martin's joy and the surprise of many of the guests who never expected to see Edward. Montgomery get married, but anyone who observes them together can see the genuine happiness radiating from both. Catherine is present, having finally found the courage to face Edward and ask forgiveness for her past choices. The conversation between them was difficult, but necessary, and although complete forgiveness may take time, they've reached an understanding. For Isabella's sake and for the future they want to build, both are willing to leave the past in the past. Later that night, when the guests finally depart and the mansion returns to silence, Edward and Isabella find themselves on the balcony of their room, now their room, looking at the stars. Are you sure you won't regret it? Edward asks, playing with the engagement ring on her finger. Choosing a life of adventure, passion, and true love instead of boring security? Never, Isabella responds, nestling in his arms. Even when I'm impossible and controlling? Especially, then, someone needs to keep you in line. Edward laughs, the sound echoing in the silent night. It's a sound of pure happiness, free from the shadows that haunted him for so long. I used to think that love was a weakness, he says, that loving someone meant giving them the power to destroy you. And now? Now I know that love is the only force that can truly build us. And you rebuilt me, Isabella. You made me remember who I was before pain defined me. We rebuilt each other, she corrects. Together. Together, he agrees, kissing the top of her head. They remain like this for a long time, two people who found love in the most unlikely circumstances, who chose to build a future on the ruins of a painful past. It's a love that was tested by fire and emerged stronger, a love that proves that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places. And as the stars shine above the vineyards of Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains, Edward Sullivan, Montgomery and Isabella Smith Matthews begin to write the first chapter of their new life together, a life based on choice, not destiny, on love, not revenge, on hope, not fear. The past has finally been laid to rest. The future, with all its infinite possibilities, is just beginning,